A huge welcome and thank you so much for your time, especially with the land of time zone changes, to Vint Cerf. Now, for people who don't know Vint, you are the Chief Internet Evangelist for Google and one of the founding fathers of the Internet alongside Bob Kahn. Now, I reference Bob Kahn because every time someone just says you're the father of the Internet, you do catch them immediately and say, Bob Kahn and Bob invited me, so I wanted to get in there and give you the reference and credit to Bob himself so you didn't necessarily have to jump in. But Vint, hello and welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad that we managed to get hooked up. And thank you for reminding everyone that Bob Kahn founded this operation, invited me to participate, and the two of us worked very closely together. We live nearby each other, and we still work together from time to time over now a 50-year period.
That's so cool. Now, firstly, Vint, from engineering hardware and software in the 1970s to sitting here speaking with each other across the other side of the world, yourself in America, myself here in Australia, seeing each other in high definition, talking before about upload speeds of 800 up and down through Ethernet cables, and being able to communicate just in general. Is that a trip for you, just thinking back to where this began to how we sit here today?
Well, certainly what we're doing at the moment is definitely quite a trip, because in the early days of the ARPANET, the predecessor to the Internet, we were beginning to experiment with packetized speech and packetized video. In the mid to late 70s and early 80s. We weren't getting a heck of a lot of bandwidth. We were getting black and white. We were getting certainly fewer frames per second than we're getting now. The fact that we do this now casually, as opposed to a bunch of engineers setting everything up to make sure that it works, is pretty astonishing. But anyone who knows anything about how the Internet functions and its layered architecture will be, like I am, totally amazed when a web page actually shows up when you click on a URL, knowing how much had to happen for that page to show up on your laptop or your desktop. So I'm always amazed that this works, given all the amazing complexity, the number of different components, and also organizations that are involved, whether they're operating parts of the Internet or whether they're part of the structure of allocating domain names and IP addresses, or carrying out the routing, or doing programming at the edge for some of the applications. It's an amazing amount of stuff that has to work. And even though you hear things don't work from time to time, which is quite true, it's astonishing how many people and how much does work over the course of a day.
It's incredible. And this interview, firstly, comes with an apology. I am only one half of the hosting of this show. Dylan Alcott is usually part of this, but because of the time difference, and he was doing a late night conference, so it's 7 a.m. here. So he's going to give a big apology for not being here, but he got off stage at 11:30 last night. And then, this podcast obviously is going to delve into technology, but it's a disability podcast where we try and normalize disability. And what's your relationship, if you come to a sharing, Vint, with disability?
Yes, I'd be happy to. I was born 6 weeks prematurely in 1943. And in those days, it wasn't quite clear what to do with a preemie who was having trouble breathing. So they stuck me in an oxygen tent. And we speculate that the consequence of getting pure oxygen may have started a nerve loss, hearing nerve loss, that has proceeded over time. And so roughly speaking, my hearing has gotten worse by, say, 1 dB a year. At this point, I'm probably 75 dB down in both ears. The losses are flat, however, so I don't have a lot of variation in acuity at different frequencies. The result of that is that amplification mostly has worked. So I've been wearing hearing aids since I was 13, and both binaural hearing aids. And the hearing aids get better over time, and my hearing gets worse, and it sort of evens out. The more dramatic connection I have is that my wife was born with normal hearing, but lost all of her hearing when she was 3 years old. She had spinal meningitis, and that destroyed the ciliary hairs inside the cochlea, rendering her profoundly deaf. And for 50 years, she was lip reading exclusively. She wasn't a signer or anything. Until she got a cochlear implant in 1996, which at that point was just beginning to be standard therapy for someone with her kind of loss. The fact that this works is nothing short of dramatic. It's just as dramatic as getting the web page across the internet. When you think about what's going on, the speech processor is taking in sound from a microphone. It's analyzing the frequencies by doing a Fourier transform. It's trying to figure out which electrodes that are embedded in the auditory nerve should be stimulated to cause the brain to think it's hearing, because it's receiving pulses that emulate what it would normally have gotten if the ciliary hairs were moving and were generating appropriate neural impulses. So she had this first operation done in 45 minutes. It was an outpatient operation in 1996. And a couple of weeks later, she went back to have the speech processor activated, which basically means what's the map from the received frequencies to the electrode stimulation. And within about 20 minutes of putting that first map together, she picked up the phone and called me, and we had a conversation on the phone after 30 years of marriage without benefit of telephone. So it wasn't a deep conversation, but it was very moving, and it was really amazing. By the time I got home, I couldn't get her off the phone. She would take any calls coming from, any marketing people. And then she got very aggressive about hearing. So she got a little microphone with a wire that plugged into the speech processor so she could clip that to a lapel. She got an FM transceiver so that she could hang that around the neck of a speaker in a conference who was 50 feet away. She got patch cords so she could plug into the plane's audio and listen just to the movie and not to the screaming kid that's 2 seats away. And then she called the library and she said, "Can I get recorded books for the blind?" Because she wanted to hear words that she hadn't heard. And they said, "Sure, no problem, name, address, phone number." And then they said, "Now you're blind, aren't you?" And she said, "No, I'm deaf." And there's this long pause where they're trying to figure out how the hell is that going to work.
This is a waste of a rental. What are we lending this audio books out to someone who can't hear?
Yeah, it was really great. So, and she listened to like 500 books, and now she can tell accents and mispronunciations and everything else. Then she got a second cochlear implant in the other ear, so now she's binaural. So, and of course, over the course of 30 years now, those technologies have become better and better over time. So I'm very excited about technology and its ability to enable people to do things that their bodies are interfering with their ability to do these things. The thing that I regret, however, is that as flexible as the computers are, it's turned out to be a real challenge to write software which is enabling for people that have disabilities. It turns out it takes a fair amount of, I would say, innovative thinking to figure out how to build interfaces that will work across a broad range of assistive needs. And so I feel like we need to teach people more how to do that design. And often the best way to do that is to show them examples of what works and what doesn't work. And sometimes you can intuit the strategies that make things work by seeing examples of things that don't work.
I think that's an amazing part of your story, Vint, is obviously technology driving your life early on, being one of the creators of the internet, but then also finding that intersect, which is accessibility because of your lived experience with disability being hard of hearing. There's kind of 3 parts to this interview for me around both of those topics. And I was going to break it down into the internet, into your life with hard of hearing, and then also Sigrid, your partner. But because we jumped into Sigrid so well, I thought I could ask a question about accents, because I did find that fascinating. One of those things, I'm able-bodied, is my curiosity was so piqued about that. It wasn't something I immediately thought about. What does she think of the Australian accent? Because, it's divisive.
Well, that's interesting. Of course, and we have eventually learned, having visited New Zealand as well as Australia, that there is a distinction between the two.
Well, thank you. Thank you for recognizing that, because we think it's incredibly different. But yeah, it's a broad stroke.
And that's different, again, from, say, London, or maybe going further north, and Cockney accents are different from Oxford accents.
Yeah. Even people say South Africa can sound Australian, which blows my mind.
When you listen to English spoken by a South African, you can sense the sort of the Dutch origins of the Afrikaans, and it shows up in the accent that we see as an accent here in America. Of course, we don't notice that our own language is accented when other people listen to us. And even within the United States, we can see quite noticeable variations. If you go to Cambridge, for example, you can tell that there are these long, the R turns into a long A. And you get down to Texas, and the R's are emphasized, and they're all, it's really fascinating. I think that for people who are hearing impaired, this can be a challenge because if people swallow the consonants, for example, which are the high frequency components, often that really prevents you from understanding what's being said. If all you hear is just the vowels, unless you can see the face, and even then there are certain letters that look the same. If you can't hear them, you can't tell the difference.
So Sigrid's fascination with sound and hearing spoken word, it might not make the edit, but before this, we were just going through some sound checks, and you were just rattling off a few languages. I even claimed that you're a polyglot, which you didn't take credit for, but I'm putting it out there. Now, does Sigrid have want to learn beyond the English language after taking on that?
Absolutely. Although the first class that she took was a written German class as opposed to a spoken German class because it was a correspondence class. And we travel with some frequency in Germany now, at least once a year in Heidelberg. So she has picked up some of the spoken German as well. She did try to learn Hindi, but it was just too hard. This is before she had her cochlear implant, and so that was just too hard. Then the alphabet, of course, has to be learned as well. Let's see. She has a reading capability for Spanish, but not necessarily an oral Spanish. So I think that's still a big challenge. Music is also a big challenge because the filter through which she's hearing the music is constrained by the 16 electrodes that are in the cochlear implant as opposed to the 3,000 possible typical frequencies that we can hear in the speech range. However, the cochlear implant technology has improved fairly significantly, and the most recent speech processor equipment that she got actually gave her an appreciation for music that before sounded like a garbage disposal. So like Bach, for example, on the organ was all muddled together. More recently, she said it was actually attracting her and she enjoyed listening to it. So as soon as she said that, of course, we ran downstairs and fired up the 5.1 audio system and played, Bach and Beethoven and all these other things, Wagner. So it was very exciting to find that you could stimulate more than one electrode at the same time and get some sort of interesting beat effects that caused the brain to think that it was getting more acuity than it might otherwise have gotten.
A question for you that I just because of your wealth of knowledge, that you might know that I'm now, that just sparked curiosity in, is, do you know how like sometimes when you say to someone, the sky is blue, and I have my version of blue, and we can describe it the same ways, but that might be your green. Have you wondered if that choice of music, if Sigrid is hearing exactly what, you might hear,
Yeah, that's a very good point. And whatever it is she's hearing, if she likes it, then it doesn't matter to me. If what she is hearing is enjoyable for her, then it doesn't matter whether it's the same enjoyment that I get. And I know, just given my own loss over time, there's certain pieces like the Magic Fire music, the Zauberfeuer music from Wagner, from the burial of Brunhilde. At the very end of that music, it gets very soft. And I used to be able to hear pretty clearly the little flute and the triangle that would just end in this very, very sweet, very, very tinkly thing. Then more recently, I was not hearing that. I knew what it was supposed to sound like, and so I was sort of hearing it anyway out of memory. But then recently, I managed to get some better recordings and higher quality rendition, and I was picking up with the headset. I was picking up again this part that I really enjoyed in the past because of this delicate nature. So, I'm sure everyone doesn't hear exactly the same thing. I'm always astonished at conductors who've got this whole damn orchestra in front of them and, instruments going left and right and everything else. And in practice, they stop and they say, okay, the flute is, half note off and you came in, a quarter of a note too soon and, you're ruining the entire piece. It's astonishing.
Yeah. It's like looking at everything in multi-track and being able to dissect each instrument at one time. That's a different level of listening. So back to, I guess, the engineering portion of creating the internet. I've got a question that I hope you don't find, I'm sure you won't find it offensive, but was there anything sacrificed with accessibility for the sake of technology progress in those early days?
So that's a really interesting question. And I have to say that we were not particularly driven by the accessibility question. We were driven by how the hell do you make this work at all?
Mm.
And so we had fairly simple, easily stated goals, like, can you get multiple brands of computers to share data with each other and correctly deliver it and interpret it? And so we had a lot of variation to worry about. The character sets used by different computers were not the same. Some were 8-bit ASCII, some of them were 7-bit ASCII, some of them were IBM episodic. And we faced that problem in the original ARPANET, the predecessor to the internet. And of course, we had to use solutions that were similarly based in the internet. And then there was the complexity of the different networks with different error rates and delays and loss rates, bandwidths, addressing structures. There was quite a bit of variation in the system, and we had to overcome that with some kind of very simple set of standards that everybody could implement. So the accessibility thing tends to be at the application space, whereas we were focused down below that level, just making sure packets get to the right destination in a timely way. That timely, by the way, was very important, is how come the IP protocol was split off from the original TCP. And it was split off so that we could do delivery quickly of packets, even if we lost some. And the reason that that was important is that for voice communication, latency is really a critical element. A high latency voice system, you end up stepping on each other. And in the case of a military application, if you're doing radar tracking, you sure as hell don't want to know where the missile was. You want to know where it is. And so the fact that you lost one of the radar pings and you went to a whole lot of trouble to transmit it to get it to the other end means you've just introduced increased delay in getting the most recent data. And so we split IP off to be an unreliable but low latency delivery mechanism, which turns out to be important for video and voice. So all the work that I was doing at that point was below the level of most of the accessibility issues that arise when you're trying to design and build a user interface. And whether that's an interface to a time-sharing system or an interface to a web page or something along those lines is way up high in the application space. So I was focused for most of my career on the underlying transport system, but I had personal interest in the accessibility side of things, which over time has been an increased focus for me, recognizing that just like the people, this is the irony of the telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell, whose wife and mother were deaf and could not use the phone. And it's ironic. And we didn't get to use the phone in the deaf world until we got teletypes and the little modems that would allow us to type at each other. Hmm. And of course, now we've got this kind of communication plus captions that are real time because the computers are doing the word recognition, not always perfectly, and sometimes amusingly, but nonetheless amazingly well. And it's getting better and better as we get more large language model processing of speech recognition.
I read something and I need to clarify it because I'm sure there's nuance to everything in a startup world of building the internet. But did I read that you, because of, and sorry, I keep saying hard of hearing. Do you identify as hard of hearing, not deafness?
Well, I'm not totally deaf,
Yeah.
and so I'm hard of hearing or hearing impaired,
Yep.
uh, and I can be rescued with hearing aids. Whereas if I were truly deaf, I would either be signing or lip reading or work using captions or something.
So the first ever email was, I read in some respect, I think the word protocol was used in that term when doing some research on you. The first email protocol was written by yourself. And what was the application for that email?
Well, actually, no. Let's make
Okay.
sure that we get this straight. The first networked electronic mail was developed by a man named Ray Tomlinson. He worked for a company called Bolt, Beranek and Newman, passed away not very long ago. But he introduced the notion of networked electronic mail in 1971 on the ARPANET project. And it took the place by storm. We all recognized that the use of email meant that we could be working in different time zones. You and I would appreciate that especially. And that I could send you an email while you were asleep and you could read it when I'm asleep and we could exchange email. And that was the primary application on the internet for quite a long time. Remote access to time sharing systems interactively, file transfers back and forth, and electronic mail. It wasn't until the World Wide Web shows up in late 91 that we started to see a blossoming of other kinds of applications that happened. But email was very important to me in my career. So after I left the Advanced Research Projects Agency, having led the Internet project there until late 1982, I went to work for a company called MCI. And I was asked to build a system for them, which we eventually called MCI Mail, which was an email service. We thought of it as a digital post office. And so I did engineer that. But it was not the first email system. The first ones came in 71, and there were other email services, even at the time that I was working on this product, that were already in existence, like CompuServe, for example. My purpose in building MCI Mail was to interface with other email systems, in addition to offering a service to the users subscribing to that. And the thing that has been part of my thematic career has been to work in environments where email was the norm, that everyone used email to communicate. I'm still endlessly online sending and receiving emails, partly because it allows me to work with the time across these multiple time zones. And because the work I do has a global character to it, I am very much enabled by the use of this computer mediated email. So I've always selected jobs that had that component in it because it was so enabling for me.
And did you recognize straight away, while people were going, Eureka, time zone difference, we can, be more global in a working economy? Did you sort of immediately recognize the accessibility of it, of being able to communicate with Sigrid back home?
Yes, and in fact, that was a very important element in my persistence in using electronic mail. Eventually, what was really quite weird is that the MCI mail system was also connected to the telex system, and it was connected to CompuServe, and eventually it was connected to the internet. And so I was very proud of the fact that we were able to combine all these various possible sources and syncs. Eventually, we included the ability to print an email on a piece of paper and mail it to someone. So in the very early days of this product, which was launched in September of 83, some people weren't online at all. But you could send an email to an email address, a telex address, eventually a fax address, and to a postal address. And we would print it out, put it in an envelope, put it in the postal system. And if you said it was urgent, we would send it by FedEx. So I was very proud of the flexibility of that design to communicate with people who weren't yet up online.
Brilliant. I mean, still to this day, the email obviously has evolved in some respect, but the fundamentals, it's just crazy when technology is going exponentially up. The email at its core is still, what it was back then, which is unbelievable. Vint, question about accessibility. There's this new iPhone update that you can do which is for people who are losing their voice, maybe from condition like MND, for example. And before, maybe near your diagnosis, Apple allows you to enter in, spend about 15 minutes reading out some voice prompts. And then from losing your voice due to, deterioration of the condition, you can still send texts and your voice is still able to be sent via voice memo. How do you feel about that? Because as a podcaster as well, there is a program called Descript that you can do the same thing and basically create a podcast with your voice just by texting. And I'm up in the air about it. I mean, not necessarily the accessibility, that it's an opt-in, so those people who want it, that's amazing. But where do you sit on it as someone who's so into the accessibility space?
Anything that enables communication to first order seems to me very attractive. We have experimented with a number of accessibility tools at Google. One of them is called Live Transcribe, which basically on the mobile phone takes in the sound and transcribes it for you in 120 different languages. It doesn't do translation, although I'm sure that's coming, but it will. If you tell it in advance, you should be listening for English or Bulgarian or Spanish or Italian. It will transcribe fairly reliably. We also have experimented with people whose voices, the ones that you were implying, whose voices are beginning to decay or might be impaired. For example, we have one employee who has cerebral palsy. Her voice is difficult for people like me, especially, to fully understand. But we've trained a large language model or some machine learning model to recognize her speech and then transcribe it correctly. We've even done something called euphonia, which will take impaired speech and produce good quality sound in real time based on its ability to recognize the otherwise impaired speech. And of course, that takes you into text to speech and speech to text. And that raises, of course, the implication that I think you were hinting at, which is if you can take text and render it to sound like a particular person, what happens if you make that particular person say something they didn't actually say?
Mm.
And then here we get into the big complexities and arguments of large language models and multimodal LLMs that might be used to render false testimony, so to speak, falsely show you doing something or saying something that you didn't actually do. And so there's a lot of concern about how to detect that or to insist that if you generate output of that type, that somehow there's a fingerprint, there's a way of saying this was generated artificially. I think we're still some ways away from fully understanding how to achieve that kind of watermarking, so to speak, in a reliable way. And we have to remember that there have been people who have been faking stuff independent of these AI type technologies for years, maybe centuries. It's just that now more people have the ability to do it than did before because the computer does it for them. And they don't have to have the same skills that, say, an engraver would have to make fake money.
Vint, going back now, if it's possible, to talk about your diagnosis, your hearing loss was detected around the age of 9. It was noticed around being inattentive in class. Mainstream schooling. Dylan, the partner, my co-host, he's all about putting people with disability into mainstream schools. That's sort of off his lived experience as well. What was your thoughts on that and looking back on it and reflecting?
Well, first of all, first they were going to put me in a special class, and then they decided, well, maybe that wasn't necessary. They put me in the front of the room so I could hear the teacher better. But sometimes that didn't work very well because if somebody in the back of the room asked a question and the teacher said yes, I didn't get any information out of that because I didn't know what the question was. By the time I was about 13, which would put me into the 8th grade, I started wearing hearing aids because my hearing had gone to about 25 dB down, which is sort of on the edge of habitable. The awkward thing about that is that I was starting to get interested in girls right about that point. And the thing that you discover is if you're wearing behind the ear hearing aids and you're making out, they squeal. And so now you have a problem because if you take them off, you can't hear. If you leave them on, it destroys the mood. So, I found that to be kind of a problem. I've gotten to, as I got older, of course, I realized that it was important to let people know that I wear hearing aids, that I might be inattentive unless I knew they were talking to me. Starting a conversation behind my back may not work. And tap me on the shoulder so I know you're talking. And I think even though I'm not a good lip reader, Sigrid was excellent because she had to lip read for 50 years. Uh, I still rely to some extent on lip reading. So this podcast, for example, is enhanced by the fact that I can see you as well as hear you. So for me, the hearing aid experience started out being a little awkward, and I was the only kid in my class that wore hearing aids, so that also kind of singled you out. But as I've gotten older, I've become very comfortable with explaining to people, what my needs are. My staff know that I need quiet rooms for meals if I'm going to be having a conversation. I know that I should bring a headset and look for an FM receiver if I'm going to be in a big noisy auditorium or doing Q&A up on the stage. So after a while, you become accustomed to making sure that you can hear.
And then I just find it really interesting that you've gone through the process of hearing aids as technology has advanced them. When you did start wearing hearing aids, what did they look like? That was, the size of them and the feel. I mean, you kind of gave a small description about them being sort of unsightly, especially when trying to get into the dating world. And was that electronic? And then did you move to transistor by the time?
Well, they were already transistors.
Right.
So let's do the math. I'm 13 years old. Okay, so I was born in 1943. So we're talking 1956. Transistors had been invented 10 years before, Bell Labs. By 10 years later, they were small enough, and the amplifiers, all we were getting basically was unsophisticated amplification. They fit behind the ear aid. It was big, but it was, on the order of an inch and a half.
Yeah.
And so it was not an uncomfortable thing to wear on the ear. It's not like my head was falling over. Now, what has happened, of course, with the time is that the hearing aids have gotten smaller, but they've also gotten far more powerful because the chips that we're using may have billions of transistors on them. They're programmable. They can do all kinds of digital, analog to digital modification or conversion, and then digital signal processing, all of which can be extremely elaborate. It can be differentiated as to frequency. You can differentially amplify depending on the incoming frequency and level of signal. So they become much more sophisticated. Some of them now have Bluetooth capability, and so with your mobile, you can control the settings on the ear. And mine don't have that, but I have several pre-programmed modes, one of which is great for telephone calls because it picks up the electromagnetic signal from the mobile phone and not the audio signal. So I cut off all the acoustics, and all I'm hearing is the call and not the noise in the surrounding area. That's actually a convenience for me that other people don't have.
I wouldn't even be able to have that on a train. Now, Vint, my final question for you, it's called the Bowl of Uncomfortable. This is where somebody sends us a question. We ask it in the hopes for people listening. It makes the uncomfortable comfortable. This one comes from Brett, and he says, Vint, catering a simple small business website for all people with disability just isn't possible. Alt text to describe images, screen reader capabilities for those who are blind, easy to scroll and navigate haptics for those with motor skill difference, and audio descriptions for those who are blind. How long till there is a universal design for the internet that makes this easy for somebody who just needs to work with wood?
Well, it's really hard. And I would say that what we might end up achieving is a menu of functionality up to some point, after which you have to do something special, an application that's tailored to that particular user and whatever their mode of communication is. But I think the important thing here is that we have the technologies. They were listed, many of them, in that question. The problem we have is that the people who do the design of user interfaces don't necessarily know how to apply all of those various alternative methods. And it may very well be that at some point you just can't make a single piece of software that is adaptable across that full range. So now you need to have specific interfaces that have the features in it that a particular user needs. But it's amazing how much you can blend things together. Here's an example. Think about closed captioned movie that you're watching on your laptop, let's say. This is now very common. It could be open or a closed caption. And the way that typically works is that you send the movie and the sound in one channel and you send the captions in a different channel. And the reason you do that is that so the channel that's carrying captions could be in any language. So it's easy to switch or even to do automatic translation. If the captions are in English, but you run it through a translation system, and you'd get the translated captions up. But now let's imagine that same mechanism that causes the system to voice the text. What if we had text that isn't for captioning, it is for alternative description? And we take the same mechanism, except in this case, we'll take the text and we'll speak it instead of showing it to you, so that what you're hearing is the description. But we use the same technology. So we buried the text in the transmission that would have been for captions, except now it's being voiced. So, I mean, there are tricks like that where you can use the same basic idea, but adapt it to different modes of communication.
Yeah. Vin, thank you so much. And I'll also point out, I just actually redid a website for this podcast, and it started to do automatic alt text on all of the images that I uploaded from my desktop, which was pretty cool.
Fantastic.
I mean, it wasn't perfect, but to see that sort of progress in a year, I was like, this is a great step forward. Vint Cerf, the chief evangelist or internet evangelist for Google and one of the founding fathers of the internet. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast, sharing your story, sharing Sigrid's story, and how the internet helped a lot of people with disability find access finally in their worlds.
Well, there's plenty more work to be done. So thank you for this kind of podcast. Let's hope we've stimulated people's interest to go tackle the hard problems.